self. So recently you did 3 videos that were discussing various things involving conservative-minded ideas, specifically ways that a conservative person tends to view the world that's different than a liberal person. And the goal of it was to improve your communication and whoever was listening when they're talking about a liberal idea to a conservative person or hearing a conservative idea and trying to figure out what it really means and what the idea is behind it. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I was recently shown a video from Big Joel when he talks about this PragerU video, and as I was watching this PragerU video, I realized that it does all 4 things that we talked about in those 3 videos. As a reminder, those 3 things were that a conservative-minded person would A, consider anecdotal evidence much more highly than a liberal person. This includes evidence that just is stated, doesn't need any evidence behind it. 2, that a conservative person would be less likely to think as hard about something, i.e. using intuition rather than analysis in regards to headlines with fake news. 3, the importance of agency in making a decision, that it's not a system, but a person has personal choice in this situation and describing things as such. And 4, that the importance of having an us versus them argument, where you have to set up an enemy and a villain and a succeeder and a hero and those kind of things to communicate an idea more effectively. So I watched this PragerU video, and it perfectly does these things that appeal to conservative ideas. Let's start, shall we?
The Lord is a God of social justice. That's the message in many, maybe most, churches and synagogues in America and the West today.
Super early on, we have an anecdote. This video does not explain anything about where they got this data, that most churches and synagogues do this. There's nothing. They just say that most churches and synagogues have this as their message, and there's nothing in there about whether or not that's true. It's just stated. So, if you were conservative-minded, that would seem just about as legitimate as something like statistics, according to the research that we've seen. More equal. Not as equal, but definitely still considerable. So we'll continue.
You'll find a lot of references to justice in the Bible, but you'll never find it preceded by the word social. But you're probably thinking, what's the difference? Isn't God the God of justice and social justice? Well, not if he's consistent. You see, God cannot be the God of justice and social justice because social justice is not just.
All right, so this is an interesting concept where they're saying that in the Bible you will see no examples of the word social justice. Thus, social justice isn't really biblical, and justice is, and it's not exactly the same thing, that they're kind of different. Well, what's interesting to me about this is when you think about it, intuition versus analysis, the Bible also doesn't reference computers. It doesn't reference shoes in the same way that we have sneakers now. It doesn't reference cars. It doesn't reference guns. It doesn't reference a lot of things that we have now that we still apply biblical principles to. I mean, the idea that a concept doesn't necessarily exist in the Bible and that we can't exactly talk about it with biblical principles is different. And I mean, on top of that, the Bible was written in Aramaic. It's a pretty old language, right? And Aramaic being translated into many different languages over and over the many years is going to have different meanings and words. So it's possible that the term for Aramaic justice might incorporate something like social justice in it, and nothing like the justice that we understand now in English. And I mean, this is one of those things that when you think about it, yeah, that's really obvious. But when they say it as if it's truth, you have to actually think about it a little bit to realize that they're kind of leaving out a lot there, and it doesn't make sense what they're arguing in the first place. So that's the second effective method. So we're going to speed the video up here a little bit because they make more of these anecdotes and just sort of, when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense discussions. And I want to get to this next part because of the importance of agency.
Justice asks, who did it? Social justice asks, why did he do it? Lost in all these social justice considerations is the individual's own responsibility for what he did. That's why social justice advocates have abandoned the term justice. They deem justice alone as unfair. And sometimes it is. A man who was beaten by his father and abandoned by his mother is more likely to commit a violent crime than a man raised in a loving home.
All right. Agency. You see, they use that exact terminology here to explain why it's still a problem for someone who is more likely to commit a crime should still be punished as if they did. And I think that's an interesting argument, but it's also not what social justice is exactly about. It does incorporate some of that, but the issue here is that social justice also refers to the problems about after a crime has been committed, how people of a certain race or, socioeconomic position is able to have less issues after the fact. This is what I mean. All right, so the University of Michigan, which had a political economy paper, it's what I studied in college, they had this paper that was discussing about how different people who were arrested were charged after the fact. So, if you're arrested for something, you're not necessarily charged for a crime, because you can be arrested for something you didn't do and then supposedly walk out of that situation safe and unharmed. Now, if you were a white person and you were charged with a crime, that's interesting. If you're a black person, for the same thing you were arrested for as the white person, you were 75% more likely to be charged. So let's say I littered. I'm 75% more likely to be charged if I was black than if I was white, even if we were both arrested for littering. And then when you were charged, if you were black, you would get 10% longer sentences. So here's an example. This is kind of made up. I haven't seen this, but it's made with easy numbers to help the 75% and 10% kind of click. Let's say there was 200 white people who were in a Grand Theft Auto ring, and there is 200 black people in a Grand Theft Auto ring. So both of them are stealing cars and then selling them for profit, right? So everybody gets arrested. A bunch of officers come, they arrest 200 people, and they arrest 200 people. Now, in the case of the white people, 100 of them, of that 200, end up getting charged with Grand Theft Auto bad stuff. And in the case of if you were black in this same group of people, same crime, 175. That's that 75% more. And then that 100 people, if you were white, well, they get 10 months of time in jail. And that 175, if they were black, get 11 months, because that is 10% longer. Now, this is what's really interesting to me. If you take that cumulative time together, you'll find that it's about 83 years of time spent in jail for that white group of people, compared to 160 years of jail time for that black group of people. And this is for the same crime. And that's what University of Michigan is finding. And this is where, when we're talking about social justice, that when they're talking about agency versus systems, well, the system here is completely involved, because there is no more difference of choice when you're being charged, right? And that's the big thing. If justice is truly blind, as PragerU is trying to make the argument for, then it wouldn't care what your race was, just what your crime is. Let us continue.
So then, if social justice is not a biblical concept, why do so many churches and synagogues promote it? Because many Christians and Jews no longer regard biblical principles as binding, because it's a lot easier to dispense compassion than hold people to a biblical standard. And because leftism has superseded the Bible in many houses of worship. And leftism, as a guiding principle, holds that the weak are good and the powerful are bad. That's why the great battle of our time is between Judeo-Christian values and leftist values.
Literal us versus them morality, narrative, villain stuff happening here. I love the fact that they actually used verses in the phrasing, because it works, right? You want to make it as simple as easy to understand. Again, they're making an anecdotal statement of these other people doing this thing, other people having compassion, which is honestly, I think, a terrifying concept, because they're basically making the argument that conservative ideals and compassion are incompatible. And that's frightening. You can't be compassionate. Biblical principles are the most important thing when you're considering Judeo-Christian values versus the leftism. And that's fascinating to me, especially because it's relatively hypocritical. So there's a biblical passage, Timothy 2:12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. I'm assuming that this is a woman and that she's not gender presenting woman and actually feels like she's a man. I'm assuming that this is the case, that she is gender presenting and also feels like she's a woman, which would mean that if we cared about biblical principles, she shouldn't have any authority. She should be quiet. But clearly PragerU feels that that's not the case. Is PragerU being infected with leftism? Or do you think they just maybe didn't read the Bible, whoever wrote this script? It's possible. Maybe it's all of the above. I don't know. It's funny, because I literally cannot believe her in this situation. If I agree with biblical principles that they must be upheld in fighting against leftism, she's a woman, so she can't have any authority over me. She should be quiet. Or I disagree with the biblical principles, and then I think it's okay for her to be there. And I don't think biblical principles should be that important in deciding something like this. So I just can't agree with her. It's basically this argument that completely undermines itself with its own logic. The lesson here is that the conservative methodologies that we talked about in those previous videos are very effective, it turns out, because PragerU is using them and they're spending money on this, right? Like, they wouldn't do this if this wasn't an effective way to get attention. And it has over 1 million views on this video. So that's kind of a big deal where it's like, yes, it does make sense to use these methods. And I'm a little bit frustrated and kind of frightened by it because, well, when I imagine something like the lucky strike thing that we talked about earlier, the lucky streak, it just felt like it wasn't as big of a deal. And then when actually seeing someone influencing political speech and discussion with ideas that are just underdeveloped and bad, it can be very frustrating to know that this is an effective strategy in order to influencing people who are not spending the same amount of time to think it through. Anyway, another final point that just makes me laugh. There's a line in Revelations that says, "I will spit you out of my mouth because you're only warm and not hot or cold." And when I read that as a kid, I took that to mean that if you are not believing the full Bible, then you're not really a Christian. And it's in Revelations, and I've seen other people kind of interpret it in a similar way. So if we take in mindset that PragerU doesn't actually believe the Bible fully, because clearly they allowed a women to represent themselves, that they're not actually following the biblical principles, and they themselves are not very good Christians either. So as not a good Christian myself, and as yourselves, PragerU, I guess I will see you in hell.